screening. I'm Dean Gunderson. I'm the community projects manager here, so I oversee all of the community garden stuff that we do, and I also run our orchard program, which is why I'm the one talking about an orchard ecosystem. So first, a couple housekeeping things. One, you'll have to forgive this strange flashing box. We cannot figure out what it is or how to get rid of it or why it's there. So if you know why it's there, put it in the chat. But we can't figure it out, so you'll have to forgive us. It shouldn't cover any important information as we go through. Also, because this is like a presentation mode, everybody is muted, but we are happy to answer your questions. We'd love to hear any questions you have. So if you do have any, put them in the Q&A section that should be kind of at the bottom of your screen. And we actually have another staff member who's on this this presentation who will be answering those questions as best she can. If she's not able to answer a question, then she will read it to me aloud at the end of the presentation, and I will answer it then. Also, if you have questions that you think of after the presentation, you can always email us. But if you have a question during the presentation, just throw it in that chat and we will get you an answer. So, like I said, this is creating a healthy orchard ecosystem. So first, I like to start with what an orchard usually looks like. So when most people kind of picture an orchard, I'm imagining what you're seeing in your head is probably something like the picture there on the right. And one of the most common questions that I get about growing fruit is, why are they so much work? And there's quite a few reasons why they can be so much work. One of the primary ones is a general lack of genetic diversity. Most fruit trees we grow are pretty genetically limited. They're all pretty similar to each other, and one of the big reasons is because of grafting. So when we think about vegetable production, if you're going to grow lettuce, you're probably growing lettuce from seeds, or even if you get a seedling, that seedling was planted from a seed. Nobody's taking a leaf of lettuce and then trying to propagate a brand new plant from it. Whereas with fruit trees actually have so much genetic diversity in them that if you plant a seed from an apple, there's only about a 1 in 10,000 chance that the apple that will grow from there will be good for fresh eating. The other, 9,999 will also be edible and fine, but they'll probably be, either really tart, or the texture might not be great, or the shape that it grows will look kind of wonky. So there's a lot of diversity in that. So to make sure that we get ones that look and taste like we want them to, we graft them. And this is a technique that's been done for thousands of years all over the world, where we take a cutting from a producing tree and we basically stick it on the roots of another plant, and they will grow together and create like a new plant. But because you're taking a cutting from an existing tree and that's how you're propagating it, it's essentially it's a clone. I mean, genetically it's the same because it's that branch from that same tree. And that's how we propagate cultivars in fruit. So every red delicious apple tree on planet Earth is actually genetically identical to every other red delicious tree on planet Earth. And so, if you look at this picture of this apple orchard here, I mean, you look down the road, those apples all look about the same. It's probably the case that those are all the same variety. So really, from a genetic standpoint, that's all the exact same tree. And so there's not a lot of genetic diversity there because it's all just basically one giant tree. Also, there's the family issue. So almost all the fruit that we grow, conventionally, or like the common fruits in kind of the temperate climate that we live in, are pretty much all in the exact same family. So they're all pretty genetically similar to each other. And I've got a list later that shows all the ones on there. But pretty much any fruit you can imagine growing here is in the same family. So again, not a lot of genetic diversity there in an orchard, even if you have a lot of different species. Also, a lot of conventional fruit, especially when you're talking about apples and pears, peaches, plums, all those, have not recently been bred for ease of care. Breeding is for the most part done with spray protection. So they're really only selecting for like the look, the shippability, the taste, which are all important things, but they're spraying them all the time. So they're not being selected for how well they can handle those stresses without those protections. And breeding is done um, with pruning. And so, you need to prune. Fruit trees have been pruned for thousands of years, and so they kind of need that if they're going to produce well and be healthy. And so you got to kind of keep doing that, unfortunately. They also tend to be really vigorous species. Fruit trees, their natural ecosystem is they're kind of on the edge of forests a lot of times, like a lot of the wild ancestors of fruit trees. And so they tend to grow really, really fast because they are used to having full sun. And so that just means usually you're having to do pruning more often because they grow a lot faster. Our climate makes it harder to grow because it's really humid here, but we also have late freezes. But really, like the monoculture, like I said, is also a big issue. You look at that row, even if that's multiple varieties of apple, they're all still apple. The same diseases and pests are going to attack all those different apples. And so kind of growing monocultures where we're growing just one thing in a field or in an orchard makes the life of a pest easier and makes the life of the grower harder. And because fruit is delicious and nutritious. It's delicious to us. It's also delicious to animals and insects. And so they're going to try and eat it just as much as we are. So then what does a healthy orchard ecosystem look like? The first thing I say is kind of like a savanna, a woodland, or a young forest. These are kind of the models we're going for. And the reason those are the models we're going for is because that's where most of the fruit species that we grow are from originally. Like those are the ecosystems that their wild ancestors grew in. And so those are the ones that you kind of want to imitate to find how to grow those fruit trees so that they don't need as much care, because the wild ones didn't really need much or any care from people. It will not be identical. Nobody's going to walk into your orchard and be like, oh my gosh, am I in an orchard or am I in a woodland? Like it's still gonna, it's not gonna look identical to that natural ecosystem, and no two orchards are gonna look the same, because again, if you're imitating the environment, it should look a little different because everybody's environment's a little different. And so it's just kind of important to kind of conceptualize here, like when we're talking about orchards, an orchard is also called like an agro-ecosystem. So it's like an ecosystem, except it's an agricultural one. So it's not one that's developed from all these other, kind of natural processes, but they've been artificially created by people. And generally what those agro-ecosystems look like is that we've taken a natural ecosystem and we've stripped it down to as simple as possible to make management more simple. And so each of those tweaks that we do create some benefit to us, and generally those benefits, like the benefit that we're looking for, the reason that we're making those tweaks is that we usually want higher yields of human edible calories and a simplification of knowledge or management techniques. So, if it's all apples in your orchard, if you're doing a monoculture of apples, then all you got to know is apples and apple pests. Whereas if you're growing, 15 different species to try and imitate your natural system more, it means you need to know 15 different species. And so a lot of those simplifications that we've done, which make pest and disease more aggressive and more of a problem, we also did so that we didn't have to know as much stuff in a lot of ways. But when you do that, when you simplify it, although it means you need to have less knowledge about all these different things, it also means that less of the jobs are being done by the natural system. It means that, if the only thing that's growing in your orchard is apples, then the only thing that can live in your orchard is things that eat apples, because it's the only food available. So it means that it's the perfect place for apple pests. And so if that's the case, then the natural predators of those bugs only have food when those pests are bad. Whereas if you had lots of other things where there's always kind of low levels of pests, kind of all throughout the year, then those natural predators will kind of have something to live on. Whereas if there's only food for, like a 3-week period when the codling moth is everywhere, then those predatory insects have to live somewhere else the rest of the year. And then they have to come and find your orchard and start eating them before you see a benefit. And by that point, you might have lost all your apples. And so by making your agro-ecosystem or your orchard closer to a natural one, by trying to make it look more like a savanna, a woodland, a young forest, will the goal is then hopefully we'll bring back some of those ecosystem services, some of those things that nature does essentially for us, so that we don't have to do all of that work on our own. And this is just a picture of an oak savanna. This is like one of the highest quality oak savannas left. It's north of Chicago, and it's like in the middle of a suburb. It's really weird, but it's absolutely beautiful. If you're ever up in the Lake County area, you should go visit it. And so that's kind of what we're shooting for, something like that. Those, you know, trees, lots of opening between around them, lots of sun, and hopefully lots of flowers. So then the actual kind of steps. So like what do we actually do to build a healthier ecosystem? We first want to think holistically and take cues from nature, like we talked about. And these are some of the things we're going to do. So we're going to talk about, you know, you want a happy and healthy plant, disease-resistant varieties, you know, all caps, exclamation points, very critical if you're wanting to minimize your amount of work. Designing for diversity, also very important. It's the key to strength and resilience in an ecosystem, is having as much diversity as possible. Also managing your plants and helping your allies. And we're going to talk about all of those things. So starting with the right plant is a critical first decision. You know, if you want to stick in a banana plant, doesn't really matter what you do for the ecosystem. Winter comes, it's still going to die. You want a plant that is right for the St. Louis area. You want a plant that is right for our soil. So that's one of the reasons too why you'll see almost nobody recommend a sweet cherry tree. Sweet cherries will, like, our climate is fine for sweet cherry trees, but they hate our soil. And so sometimes you'll find someone who grows sweet cherries. Sometimes people have the soil that's right for them, but for the most part, like both Illinois and Missouri Extension, like, just say don't even try it. It's just they're generally hard to do because our soils are just not great for it. So you want to pick a plant species-wise that is actually gonna do pretty well here, hopefully. And then when you're looking more specifically at your site, you want to pick a good site for that plant. So if you grow a tart cherry, for example, which will grow here relatively well, but they still don't really like wet feet. So if you've got, you know, a part of your yard or your community garden or whatever you're working with, and you've got an area that's, you know, kind of higher and is relatively dry, and then you've got another area that, like, every time it rains, there's pooled water, don't put the cherry where the water pools. It's just not going to be good for it. So you want to make sure that the specific site you're picking is going to be appropriate for the species you're working with. And you want to then actually plant it well. You want to kind of prepare the site well, and you want to get it, you know, planted in the ground well, so that it's off to a good start. Because when you stick that tree in the ground, you know, like animals, you know, one of the big benefits of animals is that we can move if the conditions are not great. Plants, you know, don't have that luxury. And if you're talking about sticking in a fruit tree, I mean, you could be sticking in a plant, and if you didn't plant it right, it could then, you know, be in a not great spot, or be, like, you know, not super happy for the next 200 years that fruit tree is alive, depending on what fruit tree you plant. So you want to make sure you're picking a good spot, and that you're planting it well. And what that looks like is, first you want to dig a good wide hole. So you don't really want a deep hole. If it's a potted plant, the hole doesn't need to be any deeper than the pot is. But width-wise, you want it usually about, you know, 1.5 to 2 times the width of the pot. Or if it's bare root, kind of the same thing. You know, you don't want it a whole lot deeper than the roots are, or the below ground part of the tree is. And width-wise, you want it just a little bit longer than the roots will stretch out from the trunk. You want, when you dig it, you want to dig it like this graphic off to the right. So if you dig a hole like every other person that I've ever met in my entire life, it usually will probably look something kind of like this as you dig it, because you stick the shovel in and then you pull it back and it breaks the soil, and then you stick it in, you pull it back. And so you end up with kind of a sloping hole that'll come down to kind of a point. So you really want kind of that nice squared side. And the easiest way to do that is if you dig your conventional hole where it's got those slope sides, do that, and then take your shovel. And if this is like the side, I don't know if you can see it well on this. If like this is the side of your hole, then stick the shovel in this way, so it kind of hits the side of the hole, get it down, and then twist it, and it'll pop that side out. And it's an easy way to kind of square the bottom of that hole for you. It's also a great way to break up any compaction that you might have done, because when you pull that shovel back, all that force you're pulling back is compacting that soil behind it. And it's why if you look in a hole after you dig it, unless you have really sandy soil, which would be crazy for you to have sandy soil in the St. Louis area, if you look in that hole, it's usually pretty smooth and almost kind of shiny, and that's compaction. Because our soil has a lot of clay in it, you compact clay, it gets pretty smooth and shiny like a pot. And if we're in the middle of summer and it gets hot and dry, you've just compressed clay and then heated and dried it. That's a brick. And so the hole that you dug kind of becomes a pot in the ground, because roots only have so much force to push through ground. And so when you do that with the shovel, if you do it sideways and kind of break off that compaction that you did, that like, inch, 2 inch in from the edge, it'll break up that compaction and let those roots go right into the soil, which is what we want. You're also just going to backfill it with the original soil. So I feel like, researchers go back and forth on this. But generally speaking, what they're all saying now is that you just want to throw the soil back in the hole that came out of the hole. You don't want to be throwing in a bunch of compost into the hole itself. The idea being, if you make the hole really nice and wonderful, the roots aren't really going to want to extend out, or aren't going to need to extend out early, and you want them to do that. You want them to go deep and wide to search out water and nutrients on their own, and to anchor the tree so it doesn't just tip over in a storm. The only exception to that would be if you're digging and you pull out big rocks, and you obviously need more soil, because where there was soil there was a giant rock. Then you'll need to backfill with just some good topsoil or something. Also with fruit trees, you want to make sure that the graft is above the soil line, and the graft is usually pretty easy to tell because it'll look like this here on the picture, that kind of dog leg kind of crook that you get in the base of fruit trees. So that's where the graft happened. And it's kind of like if you break a bone and then it heals and it's fine, but it's never quite as good as it was before. It's still it's more prone to injury. It'll hurt if the weather changes sometimes. It's the same with the tree. So that graft is healed, but it's still more prone to disease. And so you don't want it buried in the soil ever, because it's going to be more liable to get a fungal infection, things like that. So you want to make sure that you've got a good, 2 inches or so minimum between the soil and that graft, so that it's not getting wet. You're also going to want to stake your tree. You just want to make sure that your tree stays straight. If you have a little tiny tree, you don't necessarily need to stake it right away, but just as the tree is growing, you want to make sure that it's not going to be leaning way off to the side. You want to make sure that it's kind of growing as straight as you can reasonably get it. You don't need to get a laser level or anything out there, but you're also going to want to protect the trunk, especially in the winter. And you can do that just with those kind of white plastic tree wraps or chicken wire or whatever you have. And that's primarily to protect the trunk from rabbits. In the winter, when in the really cold part of winter, when there's not much food left, rabbits will gnaw on the bark of trees sometimes. And fruit trees in particular, their bark is really high in sugars. And so it's one of their go-tos if they have access to it. And you don't want rabbits gnawing on the bark of your tree, because it can kill your tree. Or at the very least, it's not great for your tree. You're also going to want to mulch your tree as best you can. Boxes keep popping up. And you're going to want to do that about a minimum of kind of a 3-foot diameter ring around your tree of mulch. You can do any kind of carbon-rich mulch. The easiest one to find is just wood chips. You don't need to buy bagged mulch from the store or anything. Just regular old wood chips will be fine. But you can also use straw if you don't have wood chips, or if you just happen to have a lot of straw. You can even, you can use cardboard, things like that. But really having kind of those carbon-rich mulches is really good. Pine needles is another good one. The idea of it acidifying soil is kind of a myth. It's not a problem for fruit trees. But wood chips are generally the best and most easily accessible one to do. The most important thing about that is that you don't want the mulch right up against the trunk. You want to leave, a good couple inch kind of ring right around the trunk where the wood chips aren't going to be touching it, because you don't want the fungus that's breaking down those wood chips to start growing on the bark of the tree. Disease-resistant varieties. So this is if you learn nothing else and you haven't planted trees yet, or you're looking to plant more trees, remember this. Disease-resistant varieties are essential if you want to grow high-quality fruit without chemicals in the St. Louis region. What do I mean by high quality is like stuff you see at the grocery store or at a farmer's market. If you're fine with ones that are totally buggy and look really awful, then plant whatever you want. But if you're specifically looking for ones that look really nice, you really need disease-resistant varieties. And even with the disease-resistant varieties, you still might not get ones that look super nice because our climate is just really hard to control if you don't want to do any spraying whatsoever. And if you're, so one of the examples I always give is, so first of all, these pictures over here to the right are all some of the more common diseases that attack fruit trees in the St. Louis area and what they do. And you can see they're, not exactly fruit that look delicious to eat. And one of the examples I always give is I went to a class on grape growing in Missouri, and this was in, I think it was July that the class was in. It was a couple years ago, but it was in July. And they said that conventional grape growers who were growing non-disease resistant grapes had already sprayed more than 20 times with fungicides, whereas those that were growing ones that were naturally disease resistant had sprayed 3 times. And so that's enormous. I mean, that's huge difference in what they're doing. And so, starting out with ones that are just naturally disease resistant, essentially what it means is that if the conditions are favorable for a disease, they're just less likely to get it. They still can get it, but they're less likely to get it. And for some diseases like fire blight, which if it infects a tree, kind of moves down a branch and can eventually get to the trunk. One of the things that resistance brings is even if it does get infected, it moves more slowly through the plant. So it's much easier for you to get it cut out and to save the tree. Whereas some non-disease resistant ones, it can move incredibly fast. I had a pear that I planted that it was like an old heirloom pear that somebody gave me that was not resistant to fire blight. I got fire blight, didn't know that's what it was. And so about a week later, after I had researched, I came back out to see, to cut the branch out, and the tree was dead. It had already gotten into the trunk and killed the tree. It was wild. And so getting those resistant ones makes it less likely that it's going to get the disease. And even if it gets the disease, it's going to move more slowly through the plant, which just makes your life just infinitely easier. So seriously, it's because of the humidity is really one of the biggest factors. The humidity in St. Louis makes microbial growth go crazy, especially fungal diseases. Love our hot, humid weather. And so starting with that disease-resistant stock is really critical for creating a nice, healthy ecosystem. You can also just pick naturally pest-resistant plants. So, if you are more open to like, well, I'm not, married to apples or pears or peaches or whatever, you can just pick varieties that are less prone to pests or diseases. So some just have more than others. And so like one of the examples of this is there's a bug called plum curculio that's actually native here because we have a lot of wild plums and cherries and stuff that grow in the eastern US. And so it's a natural bug that feeds on those wild plants. And so it's always around. And it's really hard to control if you're wanting to control things organically, which a lot of the people we work with are. And so generally speaking, we just don't plant them because they really will eat any fruit, but plums are their favorite. So a lot of times if you have a plum, it can almost attract that to your orchard. And then once it gets there, it's like, ooh, look at all these other tasty things. And so generally we just don't plant plums because then we don't have to deal as much with the plum curculio. Japanese beetles, if you have a lot of Japanese beetles where you're at, if they're a problem, in your yard, neighborhood, community, they absolutely love grapes, hazelnuts, and sweet cherries. So probably don't plant those if you don't want to deal as much with Japanese beetles. And again, if you have them bad, I mean, they can completely defoliate plants in a bad year. This picture on the top right is a linden tree. And you can tell by the other trees in the picture that it's not fall. This is the middle of summer, but you can see that linden tree is almost completely defoliated. That's Japanese beetle damage. This bottom picture here is a grape leaf that's, they're just working their way down the leaf, just shredding it. So Japanese beetles are a huge problem, and you don't plant the things that they like to eat, well, then you don't have a problem anymore. They also, another weird thing we have found is that they'll eat just about any apple, um, but usually unless you have a whole bunch of Japanese beetles, they're not a significant problem in apples. The one exception we found to that is they seem to really like apple Liberty apples. Don't know why. We've had orchards where we'll have 4 or 5 different varieties of apples. They won't touch any of the apples except the Liberty, where they'll just shred the whole thing. Don't know what the deal is. There's also a new pest that's coming around called spotted wing Drosophila that got introduced, I think, only like 12 years ago, but it's moving really fast across the US. And it likes really soft-bodied fruit, so especially things like raspberries and blackberries are like their all-time favorite. So like when and if that becomes a significant problem here, and if you don't grow the things they eat, well, then it's not a problem for you. And some species are just less work in general, both from a pest and disease issue, but also from a pruning standpoint. They tend to be species that are less domesticated or have been like bred um, for a shorter amount of time or bred less intensively. And that tends to mean lower yields. And it also means that they're generally more wild and thus are more pest and disease resistant. They haven't been bred to need as much kind of coddling and care from people, so they tend to be a little easier. They're also generally more genetically isolated. So most of these on the list are ones that are not in the Rosaceae family, because again, that Rosaceae family, because they're all genetically pretty similar, they have a lot of the same diseases. So these include things like this list here, you'd say bush cherries, pawpaws, jujubes, which is what this picture here on the right is, figs, persimmons, aronias, ribes fruit, which are currants, gooseberries, and josta berries, service berries, elderberries, mulberries, hardy kiwis, honeyberries, and Munson grapes. And Munson grapes is actually one I put down here specifically as an example of the kind of how they're more wild. So most of the grapes that are not disease resistant, the ones that are the hardest to grow, are the European grapes, which have been cultivated and bred and farmed for thousands of years in the Mediterranean region The Munson grapes were varieties that were bred by a guy in Texas in the 1800s by crossing those with wild grapes in the United States. And because of that wild grape genetics, they're much easier to grow, much more pest and disease resistant, which is just an example of how that, bringing in those wild genetics is really can be helpful. So going beyond the individual kind of plant, or just looking at like, well, which ones do I want to pick? Some of the other things to consider are just general diversity. So you not only want to look at like which ones do I want to eat, which ones might be good, but also thinking more broadly to increase the amount of diversity that you have, because diversity is a big key to a healthy ecosystem. And there's 4 types of diversity that you can consider. And we're going to talk about each of these 4, but it's varietal, species, familial, and geographical. And maximizing diversity in as many categories as possible, but all 4 categories ideally can really boost the resilience of your orchard. So the first one is varietal diversity. So that's just the idea of, if you're going to grow more than one of a species, so if you're going to grow more than one peach tree, it's best to select multiple varieties of peach. So if you're going to plant 10 peach trees, don't plant 10 contender peaches. Plant 10 different varieties of peach if you can find them, and they're disease resistant. So maximizing it that way is kind of what we're talking about from a varietal diversity standpoint. It gives you more diversity within that species. So they're not identical to each other, because remember with grafting, if it's the same variety, it's essentially the same tree. And so, and again, if you're thinking about the same tree, what you're essentially thinking about is we're talking about zero difference from a pest and disease perspective. It's all essentially the same tree from the pests view. So then species diversity is kind of one higher. So the idea of, if you're going to plant 4 trees, don't plant 4 peaches. Maybe you plant 2 varieties of apple and 2 varieties of pear. And so then you're getting, 2 different species. So that's, your species diversity. Or better yet, you can plant 2 varieties of apple, 1 peach and 1 persimmon. So species level genetic diversity gives you just more protection from disease or pests, because there's quite a few species of insect pests or disease pests that really prefer or really only attack one species. And so if you have multiple species, you're hedging your bets in terms of if it's a really bad pest year for something that only attacks peaches, but you've got two other, but you also got apples and pears, then even if your peaches are really bad that year, your apples and pears might still be good. So familial diversity is where we get a little bit out of the realm of what a lot of people talk about. So beyond planting different species, we also want to think about planting species from different families. Can be even better. And like I've said, we've mentioned a couple times already, the Rosaceae family dominates fruit crops. And there's many diseases that will attack all plants in the same family. So even if you plant a lot of different species and you're like, oh, look at how diverse this orchard is, if they're all in the Rosaceae family, they might still be certain diseases or pests that will attack a lot of them, because they're actually pretty closely related. And one of the best ways to identify plants in the same family is by the flowers. And this picture, or this series of pictures down here, I really like. So you can see these first four here, how they all look pretty similar to each other. And then you look at this last one here on the right, how that looks, pretty different. I mean, like not only the color, but just like the shape of it. There's almost kind of like a tulip kind of shape, like an upside down kind of tulip, or whereas these are all kind of flat. So believe it or not, what these species are here, so these first four are all Rosaceae family. And you can tell, like I said, so all these flowers look similar. So this one on the far left, this is an almond tree. The second one is a peach tree. This third one is a blackberry plant. And this last one is a strawberry plant. So for the most part, if somebody had an orchard that had some almonds, some peaches, some blackberries, and some strawberries, you'd be like, wow, that's a lot of diversity. But they're all the same family. Whereas this last one is a pawpaw. Completely different family, not related at all. There are no pests or diseases that overlap between a pawpaw and any of these other ones. And so the Rosaceae family is kind of like the titan of fruit families. So it includes all of these. And if you kind of read through that list and then start thinking about what fruit could I grow here that is not in this list, there's not a whole lot that usually come to mind. These are usually the ones that are at the top of the list for people. And they're generally the ones that you'll find for sale at most nurseries. And so there's not a lot of familial diversity in kind of our conventional fruit that we think about. And so again, getting out of that. So growing pawpaws, growing persimmons, growing those disease-resistant grapes. Those are all in different families. Growing ribes fruits, your currants, your gooseberries, those add familial diversity. Those are not related to any other fruits that we grow. So there's no pests or diseases that kind of cross between the Rosaceae family and these other ones. So kind of doing that. So if we kind of go back to the same analogy, if you're growing 4 fruit trees, do 2 apples, some pawpaws, some persimmons. And then you've actually got 3 completely different families and 3 different species. And hopefully you're doing a couple different varieties in each one. So then beyond just the plants that you're picking, the last diversity is geographical diversity. So it's just the idea of mix up the planting plan. So, if you're planting things, don't plant all your orchards or all your apples in one block, all your peaches in one block, all your pears in one block. You can mix them together. And that's a form of diversity. It's a way to kind of create more texture and interaction that's going on in your orchard ecosystem, your agro ecosystem. And so what that can kind of look like is separate plants of the same species. And this is just an example of it here. So this guy, he's Stefan Sebkoviak. He's an orchardist up in Quebec, and he does what he calls a trio system. So you can see kind of from these little labels up here. So he's got a pear, that's an Anjou pear, and then he has an apple, an Alexander apple, and then he has a honey locust. So not even a fruit producer. It's just like a nitrogen-fixing native tree. And he does that to add some nitrogen, but also to attract beneficial insects. So it just kind of breaks up, again, that it's not in the Rosaceae family. It's going to break that up. And then he has another pear, but it's a different variety. So it's not an Anjou, it's a conference. And then he has another apple, but it's not an Alexander, it's a golden russet. And then he has another honey locust. And then he has another apple that's a third variety altogether. So he's got, the the varietal diversity, because he's got multiple types of apples and pears. He's got species diversity, because he has apples and pears and honey locust. And he has familial diversity, because he has the apples and pears, which are both in the Rosaceae family, but he also then has honey locusts that are kind of breaking them up. And so if you think here, if you're a pest that only eats apples, and you've got this apple, and then before you get to the next apple, there's a honey locust and a pear, and then this apple is a different variety, you're making that bug's life much harder than if there was an apple, and then next to it was an apple, and then next to it was an apple, and then next to it was an apple, down, you know, 100-foot row. And so, I mean, even just this simple pattern of threes can break up that pest and disease cycle, so that it just makes their life harder. Those bugs have to go across 2 other trees of potentially getting eaten or falling and never finding their way back up a tree, because bugs are small. And just that geographical diversity can really help. Another critical thing when we're thinking about geographical diversity that I always like to remember is talking about the idea of like edible landscaping, and like when people talk about like food forests or like building guilds, there is no real reason to segregate plants by use. I mean, there's some very specific examples that's important, but generally speaking, our concept of edible and ornamental are often arbitrary cultural distinctions. And a lot of times they're not even edibility or flavor based. There's a lot of plants that we consider ornamentals that were originally domesticated for food, and are actually pretty good. And at least sometimes those distinctions are just straight up rooted in colonialism and oppression. There's a lot of common flowers in the United States, like that anyone would look at and be like, oh yeah, that flower is growing all over the place. I grow that in my, you know, ornamental bed. Was actually originally domesticated by indigenous people for food. Cannas, the super common plant that people plant out in the spring, and it gets those, you know, big red flowers and those big tropical leaves. Those big old rhizomes were originally domesticated as a food source. They're incredibly high in starch. They're grown as a commercial crop in parts of East Asia still to make rice noodle, or to make glass noodles out of. And it yields just as much starch per acre as potatoes. It's a phenomenal edible crop. Dahlias, which again, a lot of people like dahlias. Dahlias were originally domesticated by the indigenous people of Central America as a root crop. The tuber on them, it's edible. Daylilies, the orange daylilies that most people consider to be not so fancy anymore, were originally grown and domesticated as food. Every part of it is edible, but the primary thing that's consumed is the flower before it opens. And this lower picture is actually a daylily farm for food in Taiwan. But here we're like, no, that's not food, that's a flower. Like, says who? Celosia, another really common annual flower, was originally domesticated in Africa as a green, and the green is still really commonly eaten in some West African countries, and it's real good. Like the greens on it, it makes a great cooked green. It grows through the summer beautifully. Heat doesn't bother it at all. It's a great alternative for spinach in the middle of summer. But again, we're like, no, it's a flower. Like what? It's edible. It was originally domesticated for food. And so you can mix these things that we call ornamentals or natives. There's also edible natives. So like, I mean, like, there's no reason they have to be separate or in separate beds, or that your food garden has to be over here and your ornamental garden has to be over here. They can be mixed together as long as you know how to identify them, so you're not accidentally eating something that you don't want. And so, you know, mixing those together is a great way to very quickly increase the diversity of your orchard ecosystem. You know, if all of a sudden you're not just tied to the idea of this has to be edible to fit in my orchard, and you can start planting flowers and things that you would plant anyways, you very quickly increase the diversity on all levels. Because, you know, daylilies, not in the same family as apples. And so like, boom, there you go. Irises, not in the same family. Boom, there you go. And having flowers is also a really great way to attract beneficials, which we'll talk about in a little more detail here in a bit. And so you can mix those together. It's a great way to do it. And so to be more specific about that, What we're talking about here is you can layer your plantings. You can mix things together. So if you have a tree, if it's like a fruit tree, it's a decent sized tree. There's no reason that you can't plant a shrub next to it. If you have a big pear tree that's growing, plant a currant underneath it. Why not? It'll grow just fine. Especially if you plant shrubs kind of on the south part of the tree, where the shrub is going to be small enough that it's not going to shade your tree. It's on the south side, so your tree is not going to shade your shrub. Why not put them together? It's a way to increase diversity. It's a way to create more habitat for beneficials. There's going to be flowers over a longer period of time. It's a great way to do it. Why not plant strawberries, which are a great ground cover underneath your trees? It's a great place to do strawberries. And then when you weed your strawberries, you're also weeding your fruit trees. Double duty. Unless you love weeding and that's like your favorite pastime, it's a great way to get twice as much weeding done in the same amount of time. And strawberries will grow just fine around fruit trees, especially the first couple years when they're small. And so those strawberries will get full sun. They'll produce wonderfully under those trees. Also, plant herbs and flowers in the mulch ring. I mean, they can be ornamental flowers, or they can be edible things like herbs or vegetables or edible flowers. So this picture here is one of the apple trees at the carriage house. This apple tree has branches that are way too short, and so it's really shady, but we still grow chives under here. These are garlic chives. They grow great every year. We grab some. They're tasty. You can also grow mushrooms in the mulch ring. There's edible mushrooms that you can grow in wood chip mulch. If you're going to have to mulch around your trees anyways, why not also get some mushrooms? And mushrooms just they grow in the mulch and then they pop up. So you can have mulch and you can plant herbs and flowers growing all over the place in the mulch ring, and the mushrooms will just pop up in between in the gaps. Why not? I mean, you get way more food that way. And they interact off each other. Fungus, mushrooms, I mean, that's a natural part of the ecosystem. You're adding a whole nother layer in there that's gonna be there anyways, but you're picking one that you can get food from too. It's a win-win. And so these are Kingstrophoria. A lot of these are way past when you would eat them, which is why they look kind of gross. But you can see these two in the back that are still small and nice and smooth. They're delicious mushrooms, and you can buy the spawn online really easily. They're really easy to get started. And under fruit trees, especially as the fruit trees start getting bigger and casting more shade, the mushrooms love it. They'll grow wonderfully in those mulch rings. So again, just the neat borders and separations that we make between plants to say like, oh, the apple is here and the rose bush is here. Those borders are for us. They're not for the plant. The plant doesn't necessarily need those distinctions. I mean, when's the last time you went out in the forest and you saw trees and literally nothing growing underneath it? Plants grow together. They interact with each other. That's how nature works. So supporting and maintaining your plants is another great way to keep them healthy and to keep your ecosystem functioning. And there's several different ways that that can manifest itself. One is that you want to prune your plants. And this is always one that seems a little bit like, well, that's not natural, or that's not like happening in nature. And I mean, yeah, probably not. I mean, plants, branches will get broken and stuff in nature. The pruning is really a response to what we have done to these plants. We've pruned them for thousands of years. They really need the pruning, and the pruning really helps with minimizing pest and disease, especially in our climate. Because again, those conventional fruits too, like when you're talking about apples, pears, things like that, they're for the most part from Central Asia, which is not a super humid place. And so pruning them to get more sun and airflow in there to minimize the humidity can really minimize those diseases for you. And so it's really critical. It also increases the yield, which is what we're after in the end. If you're growing vining plants like grapes or hardy kiwis, trellising can also really help with that. Again, getting it off the ground. If you let your grapes just sprawl on the ground, you're not going to get many grapes. They're going to be pretty moldy, and ants are going to eat probably most of them. So keeping a trellis to support those vines really helps minimize disease and also makes picking way easier. And part of this too is sanitation. So if you, when you have fruit, if it falls from the tree and it's got a bug in it, don't just be like, ew, and leave it on the ground. There's a bug in it, which means when that bug is done eating that fruit, it's going to hatch and fly out, and then it can just go right back up to your tree. So pick it up if there's fruit on the ground, and if it's not good to eat, then get rid of it. If you have chickens, feed it to your chickens. If not, throw it it in your yard waste dumpster, or get rid of it in some way. You don't want to just like throw it in a pile on your orchard, because then again they can just hatch and go back into your trees. You really want to get rid of it in some way. You also want to remove any diseased, broken, and or fallen wood. So if a branch gets a disease on it and you cut it off and you just drop the branch on the ground and you leave it there, that disease is just gonna float back up and reinfect your tree. So again, the same thing as with the fruit, remove it, and you want to clean your tools. So really between each tree, you want to wipe your pruners down if you're pruning with either an alcohol solution or a diluted bleach solution, just to sanitize them, so that if there's any disease on there, that you're not going to be, getting it on your tool when you're cutting a plant that's diseased, even if you don't know it's diseased, because sometimes you can't tell. And then you go to another tree, cut it, and then you've just introduced that disease to an open wound on that tree that you just created. So cleaning your tools is also a great way to minimize disease transmission between your plants. But mostly what we've been talking about here is plants, but ecosystems go beyond plants. The plants are what we're thinking about when we're thinking about growing food for the most part. But remember, not everything needs to directly feed you either. There are other things in the ecosystem, insects, microorganisms, birds, that can actually help you, that are critical parts of a natural ecosystem, and can also be critical parts of your orchard ecosystem if you let them and you design your system in that way. So one of the best or most important things you want to do is you want to make sure that your orchard is feeding, providing shelter, and providing places to lay eggs for pollinating insects. So that's bees most famously, but also butterflies. It can be moths. It can even be wasps, flies, believe it or not. But also predatory insects. So there's insects, like ladybugs are probably the most famous, where ladybugs will eat aphids. But there's also like parasitic wasps that are like crazy zombie, or like from like horror movie type things, where they like sting insects and they inject like a paralyzing agent, and then they lay eggs into the living body of that insect, and then that insect eventually will like go on living its life, and then the eggs will hatch inside them and they eats it from the inside out, which is horrifying. But if it's being done to a pest insect in your orchard, that's great for you. Also things like praying mantises are pretty famous as predatory insects. There's lots of great insect and predatory and kind of parasitizing insects that you can create habitat for. You can also do things that help repel pest insects, provide nutrients for the plants that you want, and just be beautiful. And hopefully all of these things will increase the beauty of your system. So how do we do that? Companion planting and working with beneficials. So for the most part, you're going to do it by planting flowering plants. So those can be flowers that you would want to grow in your yard anyways. So again, like your ornamentals, there's no reason that those can't be integrated into your orchard. But really what you're looking for is you want to try and get a continuous bloom. So what that means is just having something flowering all the time for as long of a period as possible, which again is also usually the goal of people growing ornamentals. So it fits perfectly. But ideally, you're going to want to do native plants. Native plants tend to do better here, lower maintenance, and the native ones that haven't been bred just for ornamentals generally have more nectar and pollen, whereas a lot of the highly cultivated and bred ornamentals have been bred more for showiness, to have really big flowers. And ones with small flowers are generally best for predatory insects. What I mean by small flowers is often like flowers that are actually, if you look at them, a bunch of small flowers together. So like if you've seen like a yarrow plant, it kind of looks like a big flower, but if you look at it, it's actually like thousands of little itty bitty tiny flowers. Or when mint flowers, how it's got those little spikes, but the spike isn't just one big flower, it's a bunch of little tiny flowers all on that spike. And that's because those little ones are easier for those predatory insects to get into, because they eat other insects for the most part, and they're really only eating nectar and pollen when there aren't insects available to eat, and so their mouth parts aren't really adapted to get into big complex flowers. So those smaller ones are just easier for them to eat. So those are the ones that you're really aiming for to try and keep those beneficials around. And those small ones are also just as easy for bees and wasps and everything to get than the big ones. And so if you aim for the small ones, you're going to kind of hit all your bases. You can also plant nitrogen fixing plants, and then also planting deep-rooted plants, which we'll talk about. So integrating nitrogen fixers, our favorite, or my favorite, is probably Amorpha fruticosa, which is this one on the right here. So its common name is false indigo, but there's two plants called false indigo. And the one that most people think of is a baptisia. It's kind of the smaller, kind of herbaceous one. So this is a woody, like, bush, is this one that we're talking about, which is why I put the scientific name there. It adds nitrogen to the soil, which is good for your fruit trees. It's also, for some reason, it's a native, but it tends to create really good habitat for beneficials. The flowers there, those big long spikes, are a bunch of little tiny ones, so that's a good food source. Beneficial insects have also been found to generally like the foliage of this plant, like for laying eggs. And so it's a good host plant to have around. And a good kind of number is if you plant like one of these for every 2 trees. So kind of like that trio system, if you do like 2 fruit trees and then one of these, and then 2 fruit trees and then one of these, it's a way to kind of add nitrogen into your system. Another good nitrogen fixer is white clover. So if you want kind of a grassy look under or around your trees, you can do white clover instead. So it can still be mowed and kind of look like a lawn. It's shade tolerant, but it also will put a decent amount of nitrogen into your soil without competing too much with your trees. Suppressing grass can also be an important thing. So around those trees, the mulch ring, one of the reasons why you mulch is to keep grass out, which can be hard to do, especially if you have Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass doesn't ever want to go away. And so one of the ways that we found that can be useful for minimizing the weeding in that situation is to grow kind of clumping perennials that cast shade and are like generally considered like really tough perennials. Like they're pretty solid, not like real delicate ones. They can kind of stand their own. Things like comfrey, which is this one on the right, grows incredibly fast, has these big old leaves that tends to shade out Bermuda grass. And so if you get like a nice solid kind of underplanting around your fruit tree of comfrey, it'll help kind of outcompete that Bermuda grass a little bit. But other things too, like daylilies, horseradish, even rhubarb, if you're lucky enough to have soils that will grow that. They tend to be taller. They've got bigger leaves, except the daylily. Daylilies are just indestructible. They tend to have bigger leaves, so they'll cast some shade to minimize that grass growth for you. So our recommended companions, this probably should have been a couple slides earlier, for beneficials, if you're looking to like what kind of natives should I plant, or which plants should I plant that have kind of small flowers or good for beneficials. We've come up with this list of 10. The more you add, the better, but this is just kind of like a really slimmed down list that will get you a bloom for a really long time. And so that list is there. We also have this list up on our website that you can find. But these are good ones. The only thing I do want to point out about the comfrey specifically is this variety, the Bocking 14, is a good one to look for because it's sterile. The seeds are sterile. It's not going to propagate itself from seeds. It'll just kind of clump, kind of like a daylily will. If you get like just a regular comfrey, it can self-seed itself everywhere. So try not to do that. A seed sterile one is going to make your life a lot easier. So some special cases. So some plants have direct benefits, and we recommend to plant around specific plants kind of all the time if you're able to. One is alliums, which is the onion family. So, onion, garlic chives, all those. We recommend those always being planted around prunus species, especially peaches and almonds, but also apples because they help repel borers. And then sunflowers, we recommend that you plant if you have peaches, apples, pears, or cherries, because of a very long, complicated thing that I would love to discuss because it's cool, but we're running out of time here. But believe me, and that they greatly reduce a major fruit pest of those. Especially if you want to leave the seed head in the orchard. You don't want to like cut it down in the end of the fall and then haul it off, because there's a beneficial insect that overwinters in the seeds of the sunflower. And so you want it to be in your orchard so that in the spring it comes out and it's still in your orchard. So growing sunflowers is great for those plants. So basically plant lots of stuff in your orchard, you know, not just the fruit, but all sorts of other things, because we don't really know everything. There's lots of crazy interactions that happen, um, lots of really cool things, and it'll make your orchard much prettier. But there's also some larger allies too. So not just plants to attract beneficials, um, but birds and bats can also do work for you. Um, Many pests overwinter in the soil beneath your trees, like in that mulch ring. And so birds can really help you eat those overwintering ones. So you can either go like with one of those like little hand claws, those little 3-prong things, and like scratch up the mulch underneath, and it'll kind of uproot some of those overwintering insects, and then birds can come down and get them. Another way to kind of entice them is if you kind of scratch it up and then you throw a little bird seed in the ground. It'll attract those birds to come down to eat the bird seed, and then also peck around and eat any of those insects. Chickens will do the same thing. If you're lucky enough to have chickens, you can kind of fence in your orchard for, you know, a couple days, a week or so, let them scratch around in the trees over the winter to eat those insects. Bats are another great one. Bats tend to eat a lot of night flying moths, and a lot of the worst insect pests of fruit trees are the caterpillars of night flying moths. And so if you're able to attract bats to your area, they can help knock back those pest populations. Purple martins are also just great to support. I don't know a whole lot about them. You should check into Audubon Society if you're interested in doing that. But they also eat lots of insects, and they actually co-evolved with indigenous people of the Americas. They actually prefer to live around humans because they've co-evolved with people for so long. And so they're also great to have around and to support that native species. And kind of the last one we're going to talk about is the micro allies. And I know we're running low on time. I apologize for that. But these can be really important. So generally, we're only focusing on the microbial world or the micro world when it comes to disease and pathogens. But most microorganisms are either neutral, like they don't really do anything good or bad directly to humans or directly to our plants, or they're even beneficial. There's like percentage-wise, it's really a pretty small number that are actually disease-causing for your fruit trees or for your vegetables or whatever you're growing. And there's an increasing body of work. There's an increasing number of researchers where they're looking at beneficial organisms in the soil and on leaf and stem tissue of plants. So kind of like the microbiome, if you read or into any of that, like with people, they're essentially researching the same thing, but for plants. And they're finding that these beneficial or even neutral organisms can have some really big benefits. I mean, they can increase yields, they can increase and create soil fertility, they can outcompete disease organisms, they can increase soil infiltration and holding capacity of your soil, and some of them even kill insect pests. So some of them, like milky spore, like you can actually buy and like sprinkle on your soil, and it'll kill Japanese beetle grubs in your soil. So there's definitely like some really interesting kind of microorganism stuff going on. And like on the leaf surface, so a lot of it is the idea of kind of competitive exclusion. So the idea that like if the surface of the leaf and the branch is completely covered in organisms that are not causing disease, if they're taking up all the space, if they're eating, all the food that the plant is, exuding, then if a fire blight, spore comes, or not a spore, but like a fire blight organism comes along, or a brown rot spore or something comes along and lands on the plant, it's going to be much harder for it to get established if there's all these other organisms there competing with it than if it's sterile. And so having these beneficials on there, and in the soil, they're actually breaking down the minerals and the organic matter in the soil and feeding it to the plant. And there's been some research that's found that some plants are actually feeding up to 40% of the sugars that they're creating through photosynthesis to microorganisms in the soil, because the plants recognize that those microorganisms are feeding them and they want to feed the microorganisms. So you should also want to feed those microorganisms. If the plant is giving up almost half of its food sometimes to feed those, you should be willing to put in a little effort for them too, because the plant knows what it's doing. And there's quite a few different ways to do that. And one of them is, I mean, you want to feed your soil, and especially with trees, they like a lot of fungus in the soil. So a lot of these things are going to be ways to boost kind of the fungal populations in your soil, because most of your soil, assuming that a lot of what you're working with started out um, as lawn, is very bacterially dominated. Lawns don't really have much fungus in them at all, at least good fungus. And so a lot of what you're going to do to try and boost the microorganisms that you want in your soil to make your trees and shrubs grow better is going to be things to boost the fungal populations, to encourage those. And so adding compost or leaf mold, especially if you're able to get leaf mold, that's the best, because leaf mold is really high in fungus. But both of these are going to add organic matter to your soil, which is good for your plant just in general, because it adds water holding capacity. It acts as a nutrient source, but it also is mostly all carbon. It's a great food for all microorganisms, but especially for fungus, particularly when it comes to leaf mold. It's really great food for fungus. And you want to do that kind of the same way that you're doing your wood chip ring. So you can do that on the tree, a minimum of kind of a 3-foot diameter, but you can go really all the way out to the drip line of the tree. So if you've got, a full-size tree, like this tree in the background here, this is one that we have at the carriage house. It's probably a 10-foot diameter tree, and we have a 10-foot diameter wood chip ring underneath it. And so what you can do is you can add, a layer, a couple inches of compost or leaf mold if you have it, and then on top of that put your wood chip mulch. And those wood chips, again, are really going to encourage fungal activity. Wood cannot be broken down by bacteria. Only fungus can do it. So by putting that food there that can only feed fungus, you're feeding just the fungus. You're not encouraging the bacterial growth. So you're going to help push the balance so that there's more fungus than bacteria, which is what your tree really wants. You can also, like we talked about, you can grow mushrooms in those wood chips. And again, this picture, you can see them growing right there in those wood chips. The mushrooms, I mean, they're literally fungus, so they're increasing the fungus in your soil. They're also going to break down those wood chips faster, so they're going to essentially compost those wood chips for you, adding more carbon, adding more nutrients to that tree for you, while also giving you some food if you grow the wine caps. And then always have something growing. When it comes to fruit tree, that's pretty easy because the tree's perennial. It's kind of there all the time. But it's also why, having those herbs and other things around your tree can really help, because those microorganisms are feeding on the sugars from the plant. And so so you want to keep having things growing so that there's still plants feeding those microorganisms all the time to keep them around and happy. You can also do things like compost teas, especially when you're looking to kind of inoculate a new site. If you're planting a new tree, spraying some compost teas on the soil to inoculate them with the microorganisms from the compost, and also spraying down the top of your tree to get those microorganisms on the bark and leaf tissue to get that kind of microbiome going. And if you are one of our Giving Grove orchards, you can also get holistic sprays from us, which is another way to kind of boost the microorganisms on the branch and leaf tissues. And this is just more information about that. I'm not going to go into that. You'll all get this presentation. We'll email that out to you, and you can look at that. And then these are sources for those ingredients if you want to do the holistic sprays yourself, and then some other sources for kind of organic pest and disease information, since we didn't go into the specifics of disease. If you're looking for any of those are there. I also did want to just mention this book here, which is this one down here at the bottom. So Michael Phillips has some really good information about building a healthy orchard ecosystem if you really want to dive into it. The book is pretty easily available. I think most libraries have it at this point that I've looked at. It's also not too expensive, but has some really good information on this topic, and talks about things that like herbal teas and stuff for plants that is really intriguing, but I don't have direct experience with, so I can't vouch for them. But he talks about a lot of those. So that is it. Hopefully that was helpful for what you were looking for. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I don't know if we got any, but if you have any, put that in the Q&A and I will answer those for you.
So we have a question about if you can plant on a slope.
Absolutely. Fruit trees actually like slopes. Not exactly sure why. I mean, well, I mean, there's a couple things that can kind of help. It helps avoid frost. Um, if your slope is like incredibly steep, it's going to be hard just to like keep the tree straight and access to pick the fruit. But you do not need a flat site for fruit trees at all. It's one of the big pros of fruit trees. Save your flat land for your vegetables.
And then what is a trenching spade?
Trenching spade. Um, so a lot of people call a lot of different shovels a lot of different things. So I'm not sure exactly what that one would be. I don't know if that's like one of the like the straight-sided shovels. Like my favorite shovel for digging a hole are the ones that are kind of like rectangular, like long, but are squared at the bottom. I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to. I know there's also like ones that are literally for like digging a trench that are like super, super skinny with a point at the bottom.
And then they ask about, do you need two of the same variety in order to get pollination?
So that varies from species to species. So some fruit trees are self-pollinating, like peaches. You only need one variety. Sweet cherries, or sorry, tart cherries, you only need one variety. Bush cherries, you only need one variety. Blackberries and raspberries, you only need one variety. Um, Things like apples, pears, pawpaws, you need multiple varieties for. Um, so it really depends on the species. And generally speaking, it's best to just look up the description. Usually they'll tell you when you're looking at a variety description. Um, but generally what I say is don't if the species is not self-pollinating, don't trust the nurseries that say their variety is self-pollinating. So like apples usually need a pollinator, but there's some out there that say like, oh, this variety is self-pollinating, and it might produce a couple apples, but really you want two if you want a lot of apples. So.
Okay, and then is there a local source for pawpaws, hazelnuts, and service berries?
Ooh, so if you are a community project, like a community garden or a school garden, Forest Relief is a great source for those. You can get those for free from them. Again, if you're a community project, if you are just a backyard gardener, I am not sure of like a local nursery that does those. There might be local nurseries that you can buy them from. Probably the most local source that I know for sure has them is Stark Brothers and Forest Keeling, both of which are just up in kind of northern Missouri, up along the Mississippi. They both have some really good pawpaws and persimmons. And Forest Keeling has service berries. I'm not sure if Stark Brothers has service berries or not, but they're both local Missouri. Their varieties are good for here. They're well adapted to our climate.
And it looks like that's it for questions.
All right. Well, great. Yeah, so we will send out this presentation to everybody who attended. So those where I have lists of things, so you'll have access to those. Trying to think. I will also probably send out the varieties list, where I indicate also whether a species needs pollination or not. And if you think of any more questions, you can always feel free to email us, and we will answer those as best we can. So, yeah. Thanks, everybody.